We've all heard the story of Jack the Ripper. It's without a doubt the most famous unsolved mystery. The question has been asked for well over a century: who was he? I believe we may be able to present a very strong suspect today. Before we get into it, here's a quick rundown of the murders, their locations, and the dates they occurred. Police dubbed 11 murders the Whitechapel murders, but only 5 are widely believed to be the work of Jack the Ripper. The first murder took place on Friday the 31st of August 1888. Mary Ann Nichols was discovered at approximately 3:40 a.m. in Bucks Row, now Duard Street, Whitechapel. The Ripper's next victim was an Annie Chapman. She was discovered at about 6 a.m, close to the steps of the doorway to 29 Hanbury Street. It was Saturday 8th, 1888. A month later, on Sunday the 30th of September, 2 more women would meet their end. Elizabeth Stride was found at 1 a.m. in Dutfield Yard, off Burner Street, now Henrique Street, once again in Whitechapel. Catherine Eddowes would be found about 45 minutes after the discovery of Stride, the location of this murder being in Mitre Square. The last suspected murder of Jack the Ripper was Mary Kelly. She was found deceased on a bed in 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street. Her body was discovered on Friday the 9th of November 1888 at 10:45 a.m. As anyone familiar with the case knows, all the bodies except one have been heavily mutilated, all except for Stride, whose attacker may have been interrupted. The mutilations became increasingly severe as the series of murders progressed. Chapman's uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina were taken. Eddowes' uterus and left kidney were removed and her face mutilated. And Kelly's body was extensively eviscerated, with her face gashed in all directions and the tissue of her neck severed to the bone, despite the fact that the heart was the only body organ missing from the crime scene. All of the murders were committed at night and on or close to the weekend. The man we are going to look at is called Charles Allen Lechmere, better known as Charles Cross to those interested in the case. He was born in Soho, London in 1849 to John Allen Lechmere and Marie Louisa Lechmere. After the death of Charles's father, Marie married a police constable by the name of Thomas Cross. Charles would continue to use his father's surname, but when he became tied up in the drama of the first Whitechapel murder, after discovering the body of Mary Nicol, he told police and an inquest that his name was Charles Cross, something we will come back to later. This is a report given by the Daily News relating to his statement. Charles A. Cross, carman, said he had been in the employment of Messrs. Pickford & Co. for some years. On Friday morning, he left home about 3:30 to go to work, and passing through Bucks Row, he saw on the opposite side something lying against the gateway. In the dark, he could not tell at first what it was. It looked like a tarpaulin sheet, but walking to the middle of the road, he saw it was the figure of a woman. At the same time, he heard a man about 40 yards away coming up Bucks Row in the direction the witness himself had come. He stepped back and waited for the newcomer, who started on one side as if he feared that the witness meant to knock him down. The witness said, "Come and look over here, there's a woman." They both went across to the body and the witness took hold of the hands, while the other man stopped over her head to look at her. The hands were cold and limp, and the witness said, "I believe she's dead." Then he touched her face, which felt warm. The other man placed his hand on her heart, saying, "I think she's breathing, but it's very little if she is." He suggested that they should shift her, meaning in the witness's opinion that they should seat her upright. The witness replied, I'm not going to touch her. The woman's legs were uncovered. Her bonnet was off, but close to her head. The witness didn't notice that her throat was cut, as the night was very dark. He and the other man left the deceased, and in Baker's Row they saw Police Constable Mizzen, whom they told that a woman was lying in Bucks Row. The witness added, "She looks to me either dead or drunk," and the other man remarked, "I think she's dead." The policeman answered, "All right." The other man left the witness soon afterwards. He appeared to be a carman, but the witness had never seen him before. The coroner said, "Did you see Police Constable Neil in Bucks Row?" The witness replied, "No, sir. I saw no one after leaving home, except the man that overtook me, the constable in Baker's Row, and the deceased. There was nobody in Bucks Row when we left." The coroner then asked, "Did the other man tell you who he was?" The witness said, "No, sir. He merely said that he would have fetched a policeman, but he was behind time. I was behind time myself." Throughout the history of the case, it's always been presumed that Robert Paul simply arrived on Bucks Row shortly after Charles Cross had found the body. However, in recent years, those who have put forward the idea that Cross was the killer have said that he was in the act of murdering Nichols when Paul came walking up the street. Rather than just inspecting the body, he was covering up the injuries he had inflicted on the woman. When he heard the footsteps of Paul, he decided not to run from the scene and therefore give himself away. Instead, he remained and gave the impression that he was a startled and concerned man who simply found the body on his way to work. Here is the statement given by Robert Paul at the inquest into Mary Nicol's death. "It was exactly 4:15 when I passed up Bucks Row to my work as a carman for Covent Garden Market. It was dark and I was hurrying along when I saw a man standing where the woman was. He came a little towards me, but as I knew the dangerous character of the locality, I tried to give him a wide berth. Few people like to come up and down here without being on their guard, for there are such terrible gangs about. There have been many knocked down and robbed at that spot. The man, however, came towards me and said, 'Come and look at this woman.' I went and found the woman lying on her back. I laid hold of her wrist and found that she was dead and the hands cold. It was too dark to see the blood about her. I thought that she had been outraged and had died in the struggle. I was obliged to be punctual at my work, so I went on and told the other man I would send the first policeman I saw. I saw one in Church Row, just at the top of Bucks Row, who was going around calling people up, and I told him what I had seen, and I asked him to come, but he did not say whether he should come or not. He continued calling the people up, which I thought was a great shame after I had told him the woman was dead. The woman was so cold that she must have been dead some time, and either she had been lying there left to die, or she must have been murdered somewhere else and carried there. If she had been lying there long enough to get so cold as she was when I saw her, it shows that no policeman on the beat had been down there for a long time. If a policeman had been there, he must have seen her, for she was plain enough to see. Her bonnet was lying about 2 feet from her head. Before looking at the statements, it's important to note that a police officer had walked down Bucks Row at approximately 3:15 a.m. Nothing untoward was seen. It's therefore important for our timeline that you keep this in mind, as it will come up later. If we look at the two statements, we come across a number of discrepancies. Firstly, Charles Lechmere, known to police and the inquest as Charles Cross, has given a false name for the first time publicly. All other state documents associated with him, directly or indirectly, have the name Charles Lechmere. The question is, why did he give a false name? The answer to that will, I hope, become more clear as we continue. There is also a contradiction you might have noticed in the two testimonies. Cross states that he was along Buck Row on the opposite side of the road from where the body of Mary Nichols was found. It was while on this side of the street that he saw, and I quote, something lying at the gateway. He then walked to the middle of the road when he saw that the bundle lying in the street was in fact the figure of a woman. While standing in the middle of the road, he heard Paul Roberts making his way up the street in the same direction he had come from. When Paul Roberts gives his testimony, he says the cross was, and I quote, standing where the woman was. It may seem like a minor discrepancy, but it may indicate an attempt to create distance in the minds of those presiding over the inquest. We could posit that Cross had just murdered Mary Nichols when Paul Roberts interrupted him in the middle of performing the post-mortem actions associated with Jack the Ripper. At the inquest, Charles Cross said that his address was 22 Dufton Street. On inquiry into records of the time, it was discovered by modern investigators that no Charles Cross lived at the address. Rather, it was, as we would expect, Charles Lechmere. It is this piece of evidence which started the ball rolling. If the case was being investigated today, and the retold events just reported had been noticed by police, there's no doubt in my mind that the police would have looked further into the so-called Charles Cross. Additionally, after Paul checked the deceased Nichols, he suggested propping her up. Cross said it would be best not to touch her. This may have been an attempt to hide the fact that her neck had been severely cut, a detail which would have become obvious had they tried picking her up. The behaviour of Cross becomes more suspicious when he goes to seek help alongside Robert Paul. As they approached Tanbury Street, they came across Constable Mizzen. Cross went over the street alone and informed Mizzen that a possibly drunk woman was lying unresponsive on Bucks Row. He also told him that a policeman was with the body. Mizzen presented this account at the inquest. Two less than honest pieces of information stand out. Firstly, it appears as though Cross downplayed the serious nature of the woman's condition in order to get past the policeman and go about his day. If he had said she was dead, the policeman may have temporarily detained Cross and brought him back to the scene. Secondly, the fact that he told Mizzen there was a police officer present at the scene was a blatant lie. Fortunately for Cross, this falsity went unchallenged, as when Mizzen arrived at the scene, Constable Neil had discovered the body while doing his rounds. Another facet of, we'll call him by his real name now, Charles Lechmere's account, was his walk to work on the morning he found Nichols. The route taken by Lechmere would have taken him past Robert Paul's house, but both men say they saw no one else on that fateful night. Yet if they had taken the same route, both men would have seen each other a long time before they met on Bucks Row. This indicates that Lechmere was at the scene for a longer period of time than he let on at the inquest. At this inquest, he said he left his house at Dufton Street between 3:20 and 3:30 a.m. With street plans being much the same as they were back in 1888, it's easy to retrace his steps. Lechmere said he found the body at 3:45 a.m, but it only takes 7 minutes to walk from his house to the place where Nichols was found, which means that he had between 18 to 8 minutes alone with Nichols if he had walked undisturbed to the site of the murder. In his statement, he says he was never alone with the body. This also explains why the two men who had walked the same route had not seen each other until they met on Bucks Row. The obvious question that needs to be asked is, if Charles Lechmere was the killer of Nichols, why was he not covered in blood? One reason may have been due to the fact that Nichols had been strangled before her throat was cut. Without blood pressure, there would have been no arterial spray. Lechmere would also have heard Paul walking up the road, though he claimed he didn't, which is very unlikely considering that people used hard soles in those days. Paul didn't see him until he got closer, and this may have given Lechmere the time to clean any residual blood on his hands, as well as hide the obvious injuries inflicted on Nicol. Yet another detail that points to Lechmere is the less severe mutilations on the body of Nicol in comparison to later victims. This indicates that he may have been interrupted, in this case by Robert Paul. Rather than run, he decided to enter fight rather than flight mode. This may also have been due to the lack of easy escape routes and the number of police known to be doing rounds at this time. When Paul examines the body and checks for breath, he doesn't think she is dead. In fact, when he gives his testimony, he says he wanted to move her and prop her up. It's Lechmere who protests, knowing that her condition will become obvious should this action be taken. It is at this stage that Paul says he will go and find help. Lechmere follows, and they subsequently find Mizzen. While gone, Constable Neil finds Nichols and says he noticed a pool of blood below her neck. This was not seen by Robert Paul, which implies one of two things. Either he didn't have the required light source to see any, or there wasn't a pool of blood noticeable yet. If the second reason is true, then it means she had not been dead for a long time at all when he came across her and Lechmere. The cuts were relatively new. With no one else seen, it appears as though Lechmere would have had a lot of explaining to do if he had been interrogated further. We know that Lechmere was at the scene of one of the suspected Jack the Ripper cases, but what about the others? The profile done in more recent times suggests that the killer would have lived locally, being someone who blended in, and would have had a good excuse for being out walking the streets in the early hours of the morning. Charles Lechmere fits all these characteristics. Lechmere's commute to work also took him directly through what could be considered a killing zone. 2 killings occur outside of the usual area, and we will discuss these in more detail shortly. Lechmere had relocated to a new home on Dufton Street 2 months before the killings began. His workplace at the Broad Street Goods Depot had been a place he had walked to for 20 years, so he was very familiar with the area. On Monday through Saturday, he began his shift at 4 a.m. The 2 shortest routes to work took him 40 minutes, one of which passed by the location where Mary Ann Nicol's body was discovered. Annie Chapman, the second victim, was discovered dead on Hanbury Street on September 8th between 4:30 and 6:30 a.m. This murder also occurred on Lechmere's way to work. The next 2 murders, which occurred on the same night, deviate from the pattern by taking place outside of the area associated with Lechmere's usual commute. An explanation for this shift in location has been a source of contention among those who have studied the case over the past 130 years. However, if Lechmere was the killer, the murder begins to make sense because he was familiar with the area. Elizabeth Stride was murdered near several houses where Lechmere had grown up. In fact, he lived in 5 houses near where her remains were discovered. We must also remember the date and time of the killings. They occur on his night off, on a Sunday morning with no work the next day. Furthermore, his mother and sister lived on Cable Street, just around the corner from where Elizabeth Stride was killed. Her time of death was estimated to be around midnight. Her body was not as badly mutilated as the other victims' bodies, and it's believed that the killer was disturbed before he could perform his post-mortem ritual. Catherine Eddowes, the next victim, was killed on Mitre Square, which Lechmere had used to commute to work before moving to his house on Dufton Street. It was a popular haunt for women looking for work. A serial killer like Jack the Ripper, frustrated by his inability to carry out his ritual mutilation, would have known there would be easy pickings in this area. The last murder associated with the Ripper occurred on Dorset Street, which, like the first 2, was on Lechmere's way to work. She was also thought to have been murdered between 3 and 4 a.m, when Lechmere normally made his commute. The location where she was discovered was a shortcut to Broad Street Goods Depot. Many people have speculated on how the killer would have left the boarding house where Kelly was murdered. After all, she had been severely mutilated, and the killer had even left with her heart. It's assumed he would have been covered in blood. Those who believe Lechmere is the most likely candidate believe his job provided adequate cover. As a Pickford's employee, his job was to deliver meat to butchers. Of course, he would have been covered in blood. All of the crimes can be triangulated back to the locations where he lived, worked, and had family. Let us know what you think in the comment section below. Has Jack the Ripper finally been identified? And as always, until the next time, take care.